It was in the late afternoon, and the woods were eerily silent. It took the whole day of waiting in the woods, with the golden hues of the setting sun filtering through a thick canopy to cast tunnels of shadow on earthy beds. Tom had always enjoyed these strolls, an escape from the noise and stress of the everyday world. But tonight, there was something different. Story comment below, where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. He stepped softly on the fallen leaves and followed the path he had walked on 1,000 times before. The darkness had been blissful quiet, but suddenly a sound, distant and soft yet distinct, broke through, the faint sound of whimpering. Tom cocked his head and listened closely. Was it an animal or just the wind? Then he heard it again. This time it was unmistakable, a feeble, desperate plea for assistance. Tom scrambled off the trail and pushed through the underbrush toward the noise without hesitation. He took a deep breath and stepped into the woods, his heart racing a little faster. "Hello," he called out, his tone firm though wary. "Is anyone there?" The whimper grew louder, Tom's heart pounding, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He scanned the forest floor. Then he spotted it, the small, quaking form under the fallen tree. It was a dog. Tom froze, his breath stuck in his throat. It lay absolutely still, the body curled in on itself, as though to shield itself from the world. Its fur was bedraggled and matted, stuck to its emaciated frame. He could see its ribs, each breath more labored and shallow than the last. "Oh, no," he said, falling to his knees. "What happened to you?" He moved slowly to avoid scaring the dog. Eyes opened, heavy, frightened, and full of a pain that pierced straight to Tom's heart. "You're all right now," Tom said gently. "I've got you." The dog didn't flinch. It just looked up at him in quiet surrender, too weak to struggle. Tom took a water bottle from his backpack and poured part of it into his cupped hand and offered it to the dog. The dog initially showed no response. Then, after a few torturous seconds, it leaned forward and licked the water. It drank more, slowly, tentatively, each sip a minor triumph. Tom knew he couldn't abandon it here. This was a dog who'd fought too hard to be alone. He carefully removed his jacket and wrapped the jacket around the dog, holding it to his chest. Its body was cold, and it hardly weighed anything at all. "You're safe now," he whispered. "We're going to help you." Tom kept looking at the dog on the passenger seat, willing it to hold on. It was as if every shallow breath was a countdown, and all that was left was a combination of hope and dread. The receptionist's eyes went wide when they arrived at the clinic, and she saw the dog. In seconds, a vet was upon us, his calm demeanor changing to concern as he examined the frail creature. "This dog's in critical condition," the veterinarian said, his tone dire. "We need to act fast." Tom stood in the waiting room helplessly as the vet took the dog into the examination room. His head was churning with questions. What had happened to this poor dog? How long had it been out there on its own? Could it be saved? Tom waited for news, and minutes felt like hours. Ultimately, the vet came back, his face grave. "We've stabilized him for the time being," he said, "but this here is different here. This is more than a failure to pay attention. We're getting indications of something much more sinister." Tom's heart sank. "What do you mean?" The vet hesitated. "We are going to need to do further testing. But from what we're seeing, there's more to this dog's story." Tom nodded, feeling his resolve harden. He had gone too far to stop now. He was not going to leave without answers. Tom was mesmerized by the dog. Even in the safety of the clinic, it seemed so fragile, so vulnerable. It had hardly moved since he discovered it, and every shallow breath felt like an assault. "How's he doing?" Tom asked, his voice tense. The vet looked at him, concern all over his face. "He is stable at the moment, but he is extremely malnourished and dehydrated. If you hadn't found him when you did, he wouldn't have made it through the night." Tom swallowed hard, a tangle of relief and dread inside him. "So, he's going to be okay?" The vet hesitated. "I'm not sure yet. We've conducted some preliminary tests, but something isn't adding up. There are indications of long-term neglect, but it's more than that." Tom furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" The vet gestured to the dog's ribs and legs. "These scars, they're old, but they weren't from just injuries. They are consistent with something more intentional, perhaps abuse. Not to mention, he was found so far off in the woods. Can't help but wonder, did someone drop him there purposely?" Tom felt a surge of anger. How could anyone do this? He glanced at the dog again, his heart breaking all over. It had struggled so hard to live, only to be treated like it didn't count. The vet continued, his voice grave. "We're seeing signs of previous fractures as well, ones that healed on their own, no treatment. This is one dog that's been through a lot. But what I worry about most is his blood work. His red blood cell count is quite low, which might mean something else is happening." Tom's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "We're going to have to do more tests," the vet said, rubbing the dog's head. "But it's possible that we've missed an underlying condition. Whatever it is, we have to move quickly." Tom nodded. "Do whatever you need to do. Just save him." The clinic was silent, the whirring of machines the sole noise in the room. Tom perched next to the exam table, supervising the dog. He caressed its fur and murmured to it. "Work there is a lot. You've been here for a while," Tom said with emotion in his voice. "But you're safe now. No one's ever going to hurt you again." The dog moved a bit, opening its eyes for a second. It turned its gaze to Tom, feeling soft in the eyes with something new, trust. Tom felt something lump up in his throat. For the first time, he thought he saw a glimmer of hope in the dog's eyes. It was no longer just about surviving. It was fighting. The vet returned to the room holding a clipboard. His face remained deadpan but serene. "Yes, we'll have more answers tomorrow," he said. "But I'm going to be real with you. That dog's got a long way to go. It'll take time, patience, and a lot of love." A smile crept onto Tom's lips, warmth filling his heart. "I'm not going anywhere." As night fell, Tom sat with the dog. He recognized that this was more than just saving an animal. This was an opportunity for that animal to experience life again, an opportunity it had been denied forever. And there, in that quiet, darkened room, Tom made a vow to himself. This dog was getting the happy ending it deserved, and he wasn't going to rest until it did. Tom had barely slept. He wouldn't budge from the dog's side, monitoring every tiny movement, every shallow breath. Now he felt responsible, fully invested in this fragile life. The door creaked open and the vet entered, a clipboard in hand. His expression was calm but solemn. "I have the test results," the vet said, their eyes connecting with Tom's. "And it's not quite what I imagined." Tom's pulse quickened. "What is it? What did you find?" The vet took a seat across from him, thought the edge of the clipboard. "Physically, there's been a lot of what we suspected. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, and old injuries that haven't been properly treated. But here's the strange part. His blood work reveals something very rare. Traces of a potent sedative, one that is more commonly seen in connection to illicit dealings with animals. Tom's eyes widened. Illegal activities? You mean like dog fighting? The vet nodded grimly. It's a possibility. Or, at worst, he might have been part of an operation in which dogs were drugged and shipped long distances to be sold or auctioned underground. Tom's stomach twisted into knots. He glanced down at the dog who lay quietly at the feet of the man, its eyes half open, as if it somehow understood the seriousness of what was being discussed. He was of no further use to them, so they left him in the woods. The vet went on. They probably thought he would not make it out there, but he did, and he got adopted. Somehow, he did. Fists clenched. Tom seethed beneath the surface. The idea that someone had considered this dog disposable, that his life had no worth, was just too much to bear. So, what do we do now? We try to recover, the vet said. He already survived the most difficult thing. His body's the weak one, but his spirit is strong. With proper care and attention, he is healing, but it's going to take time. Tom nodded. He has all the time in the world. I'm not giving up on him. That is when Tom considered the dog, Shadow, as it had managed to come out of the pitch-dark woods and stay undetected by anyone against every odd. Shadow was still too weak to walk on his own, but his eyes showed signs of life returning. For the first time since Tom had found him, he appeared curious about his surroundings, lifting his head to look around the room. Tom offered up a small morsel of cooked chicken. "Come on, Shadow, you've got to eat." The chicken was perched on a high shelf, but Shadow sniffed it, more so with his twitchy nose. Then, gingerly, he took an experimental bite. Tom's face lit up. "That's it, buddy. You've got this." It wasn't a lot, just a few bites, but it was progress. Proof that Shadow was willing to wrestle with fate. The vet held his smile as Shadow nibbled on a few more bites of food. "He's tougher than I thought," he said. "Most dogs with his medical history wouldn't have survived this long." Tom bent down, softly stroking Shadow's head. "He's a fighter. I can see it in his eyes." The vet nodded. "You're a lucky guy, Tom, finding him. He's lucky too. But something tells me you were destined to be together." Tom looked down at Shadow, who laid his head on Tom's leg, with his eyes finally closing in peaceful sleep for the first time in days. For the first time, Tom believed everything would be well. They had a long journey before them, but they were on it together. For the first time in days, Tom permitted himself to be optimistic. Shadow had made it through the night, and though his recovery was by no means assured, there were signs, slight but undeniable, that he was willing to fight for his life. The vet opened the door, clipboard in hand, and his face lit up. "He's doing better," he said. "Not out of the woods yet, but clearly heading in the right direction." Tom sighed, relief flooding through him. "That's good to hear. I feared he wouldn't survive the night. He's tougher than he looks," the vet said, kneeling at Shadow's side and gently patting him on the head. "Dogs like him, they don't quit easy. They've already endured more than most of us could imagine." Shadow had wandered the room and taken a few faltering steps, his legs wavering but holding. Tom found himself rooting for him. "That's it, Shadow." "Step, step, step," Tom said, crouching down and grinning. "You've got this." Shadow perked at Tom's voice, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He crept up to Tom as though glued to the floor, and his steps filled with confidence with each stride. Tom continued, stroking Shadow's neck. "See? You're bigger and stronger than you think." Shadow nudged Tom's hand gently in response. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Shadow was trusting for the first time. Things came to a turning point when Shadow scarfed an entire bowl of food without a flinch. His appetite was coming back, and with it, his strength. The vet watched from a distance, nodding his approval. "That's just what we needed to see. If he continues this way, we may be able to discharge him to your supervision soon." Tom's eyes widened. "Wait, my care?" The vet smiled. "He's bonded with you. Dogs like Shadow require stability, especially after all he's been through. I believe that you are the right man to give him that." Tom glanced down at Shadow, who looked up at him with serene, trusting eyes. A surge of emotion rose inside him. He had never intended to get a dog, but now the idea of leaving Shadow behind felt out of the question. "Well, pal," Tom said, kneeling down next to Shadow, "guess you're stuck with me." Shadow wagged his tail slowly, the first wag Tom had ever seen from him since the day they met. "You've got a second chance, Shadow," Tom said softly, stroking his fur. "And I swear I won't let anything happen to you. Not ever again." The vet popped in one final time before shutting things up for the evening. "He's fortunate you discovered him," he said. "Most people would have walked right past him in those woods, but you didn't. You allowed him to live." Tom nodded, never taking his eyes off Shadow. "No, I think that he saved me as much as I saved him." Shadow closed his eyes, his body unwinding for the first time in what felt like eons. And once the clinic grew quiet, Tom knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Tom grinned up at Shadow. "It's official, buddy. You're coming home." Shadow leaned his head against the seat and stared at Tom. It was a steady, calming gaze, one that read, "I trust you." Tom unlocked the door to his small house, stepping aside for Shadow to walk through. Shadow hesitated at first, sniffing the air tentatively. His body was coiled, his eyes flitting around the unknown space. "It's all right," Tom said softly, kneeling next to him. "This is your home now." Shadow took a tentative step forward, then another. Gradually, he started sniffing around the living room, his nose taking him corner to corner. Tom had set out everything, including fresh water, a soft bed by the fireplace, and a bowl of chicken and rice. Shadow sniffed at the bowl, then took a few tentative bites. Tom chuckled. "You've got good taste." It wasn't long before Shadow crawled into his bed and sighed, his eyes shut, his body finally at ease. For the first time, Tom saw him sleep without the near-perpetual tension that had marred his features since they met. Tom sat on the couch, looking at Shadow sleep. His thoughts wandered back to the day he discovered him, curled into a ball under that fallen tree, hanging on by a thread. It felt like a lifetime ago. How had this dog lived through so much pain and hardship? Tom's phone buzzed. It was a text from the vet. "Happy to hear Shadow is settling in. Just remember, recovery is not always a straight line. He may have some obstacles along the way, but with your loving patience and help, he'll grow stronger each day." Tom nodded to himself, more determined now. "We've got this," he said in a whisper. But just as he started to relax again, Shadow moved, his body coiled tight. His ears stood up, and his eyes focused on the front door. Tom frowned. "What is it, boy?" Shadow's low growl broke between them, eyes steady. Tom went to the window and looked out. The street was deserted, the suburban neighborhood cloaked in darkness, pierced by the yellow of the streetlights. Nothing was amiss, yet Tom couldn't shake the sense that Shadow could sense something he could not. "It's all right," Tom added, rejoining at Shadow's side. "You're safe here." Shadow finally let tension leave his body as he sank back into the soft bed. but Tom remained vigilant, his eyes darting back to the window one final time before he sat back down. He knew Shadow's smelling past had not long gone. The sun rose, flooding the house with warm light. Shadow stretched and padded over to Tom, who was making coffee. Now, steps steady, a small wag of his tail. "Morning, buddy," Tom said cheerfully. "Ready for a new day?" Shadow let out a soft bark Tom had never heard before. It was small, but it held hope. Tom got down on one knee, scratching Shadow behind the ears. "Whatever happens next, we'll do it together." Tom felt peaceful as they stepped outside for their first walk around the neighborhood. Yet, he knew in his heart their reconciliation was just beginning. There was a winding road ahead yet, and secrets left to unearth. But one thing had become clear. They were no longer alone. For the first time, Tom believed they were getting somewhere. Shadow had come a long way from the quaking, broken dog Tom had discovered in the woods. His appetite was gradually improving, his energy returning bit by bit. But something remained, a tension that ebbed up in the quiet moments, as if Shadow was just waiting for something to go awry. It was a quiet day, one that made Tom think maybe everything would be all right. As they strolled down the quiet street, neighbors waved and smiled. Shadow remained at Tom's side, his gaze roaming, ever watchful. "You're still on alert, huh?" Tom said with a chuckle. "Old habits die hard." Suddenly, Shadow stopped. His body stiffened, his ears stood at attention. His eyes fixated on something in the road, a black SUV parked on the edge of their neighborhood. Tom grimaced, following Shadow's stare. The SUV's windows were tinted, and the engine purred softly. It made no sense being there, at the end of a dead-end street. Tom's hackles were raised as he read. Coincidence, or someone keeping an eye on them. "Come on, Shadow," Tom said, forcing his voice to remain steady as he ushered the dog back toward the house. "Let's head home." Shadow did follow, hesitating every few steps and looking back over his shoulder at the SUV. Tom shut the front door and locked it as his head buzzed. There was something about the SUV that didn't sit right with him, that he couldn't shake, that made it feel anything but random. Could it have something to do with Shadow's past? He took a seat at the kitchen table and took out his phone. After a bit of a search, he found an article on the illegal dog operations the vet mentioned. His stomach churned as he read the particulars. Dogs bred for underground fights, transported across state lines, discarded when they were no longer useful. Tom glanced over at the dog who had curled up on his bed, staring with one eye half closed. Had Shadow ever belonged to that world? And if they were they looking for him? The doorbell rang, breaking Tom's train of thought. His heart jumped. He wasn't expecting anyone. Shadow jumped up right away, his body coiled like a spring, a rumbling growl vibrating in his chest. Tom went to the door, looked through the peephole. No one was there. Tom half opened the door, peering outside. The street was clear. The black SUV was gone. But at his feet lay an envelope, plain, unmarked, and sealed. He took it up with trembling hands. Inside was a lone sheet of paper bearing a brief, chilling message. "You should have left him where you got him." Tom's throat constricted in disbelief. He glanced around, scanning the street, but it was still empty. The person who left the note was long gone. Shadow growled lowly, standing menacingly with him. Tom followed and slammed the door, locking behind him. 1,000 questions hit him all at once. Who was after Shadow? And how far would they go in an attempt to retrieve him? The thing was certain. Shadow's past had just caught up with them. "I don't know who the fuck they are," he said to Shadow, "but they're not taking you. Not now. Not ever." Shadow lay his head on Tom's knee, his eyes full of trust. Whatever came next, they would take it on together. Tom's mind raced. The message was direct. Someone did not want Shadow to be found or safe. But who were they? And how'd they know where to find him? The black SUV, the note. That felt like too much coincidence. Tom knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. He needed answers. He grabbed his phone and called the vet. His voice was steady, but the urgency was clear. "Hey, it's Tom," he said. "Today, something unusual occurred. Someone slipped a note under my door, and I believe it has something to do with Shadow's past." There was a pause on the other side before the vet spoke. "Tom, listen carefully. If somebody's after him, it's for real. They don't mess around. We have to contact the authorities and have them monitor the situation." Tom nodded and looked at Shadow. "I won't let anyone take him, but I need to know more. Is there any way we could trace him where he came from?" "I'll go back through the records," the vet said. "But be careful, lock the doors, and don't leave anywhere without telling someone. I'll let you know as soon as I find something." Tom installed cameras throughout the house months earlier, never thinking he'd ever need them. But today, they were angels in disguise. Scott scanned the footage from the night before, fast-forwarding at normal speed, but his eyes were flitting over each frame for any sign of things out of place. Suddenly, he froze. There it was, the black SUV. It had driven around the block a few times before halting briefly in front of his house. The timestamp indicated the note had just arrived on his doorstep minutes before. Tom's pulse quickened. Whoever they were watching him. Tom also knew he couldn't stay inside forever. Shadow needed to walk, and he needed to walk too. But today, he felt as if someone was watching him. Shadow was quiet, uncharacteristically sticking to Tom's side. His ears perked up at the slightest sound. His eyes darted to the surroundings around them. Suddenly, Shadow stopped. He stiffened, and a low growl escaped his throat. Tom followed Shadow's gaze to the park's edge. There, partly obscured by a group of trees, was the black SUV Tom's breath caught in his throat. They were here, watching. He didn't wait. He grabbed Shadow's leash and turned and walked swiftly back toward the house, his heart pounding. He could sense eyes on him the whole time, but wouldn't look back. Tom's shaking hands locked the door behind him. Shadow paced the living room, glancing at the window. Tom picked up his phone and called the veterinarian again. "They're here," he said, shaking and crying. "They were at the park. The same black SUV. They're following us." The vet's tone grew serious. "Tom, I'm contacting the authorities. We must take this seriously. Whoever these people are, they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Tom breathed in deep and looked at Shadow. Let them try. They're not taking him. Not now. Not ever. The house was silent, but the tension heavy. Tom double-checked the locks and sat next to Shadow. He pet the dog's head and murmured quietly. "We've been through too much to quit now," he said. "I told you I was going to keep you safe, and I'm not about to break that promise." Shadow lay his head on Tom's lap, his body finally settling. But Tom realized that the battle was only beginning. Whoever was looking for Shadow wasn't going to give up easily. And Tom was not taking his foot off the gas. Not now. Not ever. Tom leaned back in his chair, his head spinning. The black SUV hadn't shown up again since their walk in the park, but he felt the threat. He knew it wasn't over. The person who had left that note was watching, waiting for their opportunity to strike again. Aiding where they could, Shadow stood behind and met Pedro's gaze with steady calm. Shadow had survived too much already. No way was Tom going to let anyone hurt him again. "I'm not going to wait for them to make the next move," Tom muttered to himself, gritting his teeth. "It's time we take control." Tom stood outside with Shadow, scanning the neighborhood as if to dare the black SUV to show its face again. But it was all fairly quiet. Too quiet. He picked up his phone and called the vet. "Hey, I've been thinking, what if we set a trap?" The vet paused for a moment. "A trap?" "Yeah," Tom continued. "They're watching us, right? What if we take them somewhere where they're waiting for?" The vet considered it. "It's a gamble, but it could pay off. I will call the officers I have spoken to and arrange something. In the meantime, you have to be very careful." "I will," Tom promised. "We're ready for this." This time each step had a purposeful feel. Tom glanced down the street, waiting for the SUV. Shadow had remained close, his body tense but poised. As they turned a corner, Tom saw it. The same black SUV parked further down the street, its engine purring softly. His heart raced, but he continued walking, feigning ignorance. "They're here," he whispered as he texted the vet. "It's happening. Get ready." The SUV slowly pulled out and tracked them from behind. Tom clutched Shadow's leash with tight fingers. Every instinct told him to flee, yet he remained composed. This had to work. The vet had the whole thing planned out wonderfully. Tom guided Shadow towards the designated area where the officers hid, prepared to spring into action. The SUV trailed them into the park's vacant lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. It halted mere feet in front of him, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then the door opened. A man emerged, wearing a baseball cap that partly covered his face. His eyes scanned the crowd, narrowing when he spotted Tom and Shadow. Tom's pulse raced. This was it. The man stepped forward, but before he could speak, the officers showed up. Their orders were straightforward and incisive. "Stop right there. Hands where we can see them." The man froze, and his eyes shot to the SUV, as if he were thinking of making a run for it. But it was too late. The officers surrounded him, shackling his wrists and ushering him toward their car. Tom, heart racing, stood frozen in place as he watched the scene unfold. Shadow remained close, his gaze affixed on the man. The veterinarian arrived moments later, putting a hand on Tom's shoulder. "We got him," he said. "But there's more. This guy wasn't acting alone. He's part of a wider network, and we have only scratched the surface." Breath out at last, Tom nodded. "We will end this, whatever it takes." Tom sat next to Shadow, scratching him behind the ears. "We did it, buddy. One step closer to freedom." For the first time in days, Shadow put his head on Tom's lap, and his body relaxed. But the house still quieted, and Tom knew their battle was not finished. They had won a battle, but the war remained ahead. Shadow's past was murkier and darker than they had known, and Tom was hell-bent on finding it all out, whatever it took. Tom sat stiffly, staring at the officer. His mind raised a swarm of questions, but one sounded louder than the rest. Why did they want Shadow? The officer leaned in, wrapping a file on the table. "We've found the man you helped us capture. His name is Kevin Marks. He's not just some random dude. He's been doing illegal dog trafficking operations for years." Tom caught his breath in his throat. "Dog trafficking? You mean like dog fights?" The officer nodded grimly. "Sure, but this is even more foundational. Marks is one of a web of people dealing with rare or highly trained dogs, some for breeding, others for underground fighting circuits. They have the perfect profile for Shadow. His scars, his temperament, Even his blood work indicate he was once part of one of these operations. Tom clenched his fists. It was infuriating to think of Shadow being treated like a commodity, something to be bought, sold, or thrown away. So they wanted him back, Tom said, his voice flat even though anger crackled underneath. Precisely, the officer responded. But what's atypical is the degree of persistence they've had. Normally, once a dog gets free or is left behind, they give up trying to catch it. Shadow must be special. Tom glanced over at the vet, who said yes. We suspected as much. His blood sample tested positive for substances used to boost performance in fighting dogs. But there's more. Shadow's resilience comes not just in the physical, it's psychological. He is a survivor in every sense of the term. That makes him valuable to them. Tom got a shiver down his back. This was no longer just about survival, it was a battle for Shadow's freedom. Tom and Shadow walked home as the sun went down. The air was thick with stuff, heavier than usual. All they learned landing on Tom's shoulders. He remained on the couch gazing at Shadow, who was peacefully lying on his bed. How had this mild-mannered, trusting dog survived such a violent past? Tom took out his phone and composed a message to the vet. We have to stop this. Not only for Shadow, but for all the dogs in this horror. The response came quickly. Agreed. Let's dig in and see what else we can find. Tom leaned back, thinking of possibilities. He was not going to allow Shadow's story to end here. They had come too far to turn back now. The house was quiet, but Tom couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop repeating the officer's words in his head. Shadow must be special. He opened his laptop, determined to dig deeper into Shadow's past. Digging through local news archives and online forums, he found an old article about a dog rescue that had gone horribly wrong. Illegal dog operation uncovered, multiple dogs missing. The article explained the raid on a facility that was tied to a broader network. Most of the dogs had been found, but some had disappeared into thin air. Tom scrolled down the thread to a grainy photo of one of the missing dogs, a German shepherd with outrageously familiar eyes. It was Shadow. His stomach twisted. Shadow hadn't simply run away one time. He'd gone missing and been recovered before. Who are you, really? Tom exclaimed, looking at Shadow, who had never seemed as enigmatic as he did now. Shadow shifting in his sleep, as if plagued by dreams of the past. Tom realized they were barely skimming the surface. The truth was out there, and it was bigger than either had imagined. Tom's heart raced as he leaned closer to the screen. Reading more, he could see more pieces of Shadow's story fall into place. Shadow wasn't just another victim. He had fled from one of the biggest illegal dog operations in the area. The article described a failed rescue mission from 2 years ago. Officials had shut down the main facility, but a few key players had escaped the net, and so had a handful of highly valuable dogs. Shadow was placed on the list of the missing, expertly conditioned, thought to have participated in both subterranean fighting rings and black market auctions. Tom's blood ran cold. They weren't after Shadow simply because they wanted him to survive. They were after Shadow because they wanted to profit. Shadow was worth much more to them than he could have realized. He leaned back in his chair, mind racing. They were not going to quit until they had him back. Tom decided to take action. He dialed up Claire, the vet, and told her what he had learned. Claire's tone was calm but serious. This confirms our suspicions. Shadow isn't merely a survivor. He's one of the few dogs who survived that operation. That makes him a target. But we can use this knowledge to keep him safe. I'll contact the authorities again and explain the whole story. Tom nodded. "Thanks, Claire, we have to outpace them." But as he hung up the phone, Tom knew this wasn't the end. They needed a plan, and fast. Tom sat on the porch and watched Shadow walk around the yard. For a moment, everything felt normal, peaceful even. Shadow's coat was beginning to shine again, and he was no longer shaky on his feet. But Tom could not shake the sense that someone was watching. He looked up and peered down the street, half expecting to see that black SUV waiting. Instead, he saw a man standing on the other side of the street, leaning against a lamppost, his gaze fixed on Tom and Shadow. Tom's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. He stood up, his body tense. Shadow noticed the change instantly and edged closer to Tom's side, ears up. The man smiled weakly but then turned and walked away, ducking around the corner. Tom opened his phone and called the police. "He's back," he said, his voice firm but urgent. "The same man from before. He was watching us." "We will send a patrol car in your area," the officer said. "Stay inside, and don't talk to anyone." Tom hung up. He locked the door behind him. Shadow was sitting by the window, staring into the street. His body was relaxed, but Tom knew he was prepared to spring into action if necessary. The house was still, but Tom didn't sleep. He kept looking at the security cameras, waiting for the man to come back. His heart raced with every creak of the floorboards. Shadow was at the foot of the bed, eyes open and alert. He knew the danger wasn't finished yet. Tom sat on the edge of the bed, raking his fingers through Shadow's fur. "We're not going anywhere," he said quietly. "They're not taking you back. Not now. Not ever." Shadow nuzzled Tom's hand, his tail giving a gentle wag, a silent vow that they would take on whatever came next together. And Tom knew they would. As he was heading out for work, the officer on duty had nodded at Tom reassuringly. But Tom had realized they couldn't depend on the police forever. If they were going to put an end to this, once and for all, they had to get the whole story about Shadow's past and take down the people who were hunting him. Tom had been up all night, looking further into Shadow's past. He wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for the truth. Each clue, each old article, brought him closer to the same grim conclusion. Shadow's story was just beginning. The man who had been apprehended wasn't working alone. The network remained, though, and they were out for Shadow blood. But why? What made him so important? Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbed his eyes. He thought of all the things it could be, and each one was worse than the next. He wanted more answers, something concrete that could finally explain how all the pieces fit together. His phone buzzed. It was Claire. "Tom, I discovered something," she said, her tone urgent. "It's larger than we imagined." Tom shook himself awake, adrenaline racing through his veins. "What is it?" "I was able to get some old records from the raid," Claire said. "Shadow was not some dime-a-dozen dog in that operation. He was part of a breeding experiment, an illegal program to produce tougher, more durable dogs for fighting. He was one of their elite." Tom's stomach twisted. Shadow hadn't merely escaped from a bad situation. He had been their most prized possession. "I mean, have they had him on their radar all this time?" Tom's voice was barely a whisper. Claire hesitated. "It's possible. Shadow's survival makes him a valuable asset to the people who manage that operation. If they could return him, they would use him to reboot all that they lost." Tom's jaw tightened. Not a chance. Shadow's not a trophy. He isn't going back to that life. Claire's voice softened. "I know, Tom. But we need to keep ahead of them. I've talked to the authorities. They're about to move. But we require hard evidence to put them away for good. Tom nodded, and an idea started to bloom in his mind. "We'll get it, whatever it takes." Tom had to clear his head, and Shadow had to go out for some air. They drove to a nearby park, a quiet place to breathe for a moment. Shadow appeared relaxed, walking calmly next to Tom, and for a second it seemed like the world was back to normal, like the last few weeks had been just a bad dream. But then, Shadow froze. His ears perked, his body stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Tom looked where Shadow was looking and saw a car parked near the park entrance. His heart skipped a beat. It was the black SUV again. The driver remained still, their face lost under the glare of the windscreen. Tom felt the grip on Shadow's leash tighten reflexively and his mind quickening. He did not stick around to see what would happen next. "Come on, Shadow." His voice calm but insistent. Time to go. They hurried back to the car, Tom looking back over his shoulder the entire way. The SUV drove on, but this was not over. Tom knew. They were observing, waiting for the right opportunity. Tom shut the door behind him, his heart racing. Shadow walked the living room, his body tight. Tom picked up the phone and rang Claire again. "They're back," he said, calm beyond the rising fear. "We need to act fast." Claire didn't hesitate. "I'm calling for the officers now. Remain in place and secure everything. We'll be there soon." Tom ended the call, his fingers raking through his hair. He glanced down at Shadow sitting beside him, with eyes still but aware. "We're not going anywhere," Tom said gently. "They won't take you. Not now, not ever." Tom's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Any noise he heard from outside made him jump. The black SUV hadn't been back since that afternoon, but Tom knew they were still out there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, his phone pinged, shattering the silence. It was Claire. "I have talked to the officers," she said. "I don't think they're ready, you know what I mean. We need more evidence in order to connect all the dots. The man they are keeping isn't talking, and we have no way of knowing how many others are." Tom clenched his jaw. "We don't have time for this. They're getting bolder. If we wait too long, they'll be gone again. Or, even worse, they'll come to Shadow." Claire's voice softened. "I know, Tom. Just hang tight. We're close. We'll catch them." Tom hung up and looked down at Shadow, who regarded him with calm, steady eyes. It was as though Shadow knew what was happening. He was prepared. Tom was also paranoid. He double-checked all the locks and the security cameras. Nothing was out of the ordinary, but the air was heavy with tension. He sat on the couch with his phone, scrolling the past few days of security footage. Suddenly, he saw a flash, movement on the screen. That black SUV was there again, parked a few houses down. Tom's heart raced. He pressed the screen to zoom in. The driver's side door opened and a figure emerged. The person didn't go near the house. Instead, they shuffled on the sidewalk, staring at Tom's front door for what seemed like forever. Tom's finger hovered above the emergency call button on his phone until the figure turned back toward the SUV and walked away as quickly as he came. The vehicle drove away into the night. Tom breathed out and his hands shook. They were no longer just watching. They were testing him. Tom barely slept. The scene replayed in his mind. Detail after detail burned into memory. What were they waiting for? Why didn't they act? Frustrated by the lack of details, Tom made up his mind to take action. "They were outside my house again last night," Tom said, his voice tense but steady. "They didn't do anything, but they're getting closer." The officer sighed. "We are enhancing surveillance in your neighborhood. We'll have unmarked cars patrolling the area 24/7. Just keep your wits about you and don't take any stupid risks." Tom took his thanks and hung up, steeling himself. He wasn't going to simply wait around for something to happen. He needed to clear his head, and Shadow needed a respite from the tension in the house. They strolled through a deserted park, the late afternoon sun frying long shadows into the ground. For the first time in days, Tom felt a flicker of peace, until Shadow went rigid, his body taut, a deep growl rippling up his chest. Tom glanced at where Shadow was staring and caught sight of a guy standing near the edge of the park, half hidden behind a tree. The man was staring directly at them. Tom's pulse quickened. It was the same man from earlier, the one who left the note. He snagged Shadow's leash and headed for the exit, walking fast but calm. The man didn't follow, but Tom could feel his gaze on him the whole way back to the car. Tom closed the door behind himself, his mind reeling. He knew they were near, too near. He had to stay one step ahead of them. He plopped down at the kitchen table, his heart racing. Shadow lay at his feet, his gaze locked on the front door. "We're nearly there," Tom whispered, patting Shadow's head. "Just a little longer." Shadow nuzzled Tom's hand. Trust undeterred. They couldn't run, and they couldn't hide, Tom knew. The only solution, the only way to end this, was to confront it directly. Whatever lay ahead, they would face together. For the first time in ages, Tom felt a deep sense of peace. It was really over. The danger, the fear, the sleepless nights, it was finally over. Shadow walked over to him, steady and sure, tail wagging faintly. He settled his head on Tom's lap, gazing up with those placid, knowing eyes that had once been frightened. "We're home," Tom said through a whisper, clicking his fingers in Shadow's soft fur. "It's a new day, a fresh start." Rescuing the dogs from the dark, cold woods to the safety of the vet clinic. From the sickly, scared dog who wouldn't eat to the healthy, beautiful companion at Tom's side today. Every step had been a struggle, but Shadow had pushed through them all, reminding himself that he wasn't just a survivor. He was a warrior. Shadow curled up beside Tom, and they lay in the sun, glowing. He heard his phone buzz. It was a message from Claire. "The operation has been entirely closed down. Shadow is safe. He won't ever be hurt again." Tom squeezed his eyes shut, relief flooding through him. They had done it. "Guess you're off the hook officially," he said, holding up the phone to Shadow. Shadow barked faintly, as though he understood every word. The park itself was quiet, the breeze cool and refreshing. Tom watched as Shadow walked ahead, sniffing each flower and chasing the odd butterfly. The neighbors smiled and waved as Shadow passed, as if greeting an old friend. No one would have known the extraordinary story behind those eyes, the battles he had fought and won. Tom dropped to his knees beside Shadow and scratched behind his ears. "You have come a long way, buddy, and this is only the beginning." Shadow wagged his tail and nuzzled Tom's hand. Not all stories are happy endings. Sometimes it may take a long road with unforeseen obstacles and heartbreak. But the beauty is, no matter how much darkness, there's always the possibility of a new beginning. Shadow's story taught us that life was not just about being alive. It was about hope, trust, and second chances. Sometimes it only takes one person to fight for you to change everything. We appreciate you all coming along on this wonderful adventure with us. If you too believe in the power of second chances, like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.